Welcome to Reformed Thinking. Today we are going to do a deep dive into some really fascinating historical texts.
Yeah, we had a lot of ground to cover today. It's going to be a big one.
It is. And, I want you, the listener, to just imagine something for a second. Imagine trying to synchronize a massive global event down to a specific day.
Right, which is a huge logistical headache even now.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
But imagine trying to do that knowing your only communication tool is like a piece of paper on a wooden ship.
Yeah, a wooden ship that has a pretty high probability of just, well, sinking.
Exactly. Sinking or maybe being captured by privateers or honestly just having the letters rot in some damp cargo hold for months.
It's staggering to think about. We are talking about an era governed entirely by paper, ink, and the completely unpredictable nature of Atlantic trade winds.
Right.
Like, a letter dispatched from Edinburgh might reach Boston in 6 weeks. Or it might take 3 months. Or it might just end up at the bottom of the ocean.
Yeah. But somehow, through that incredibly fragile medium, a huge unified theological response was mobilized across multiple continents. And that is the mission of our deep dive today.
Yeah, we are tracking a transatlantic movement that managed to pull off a coordinated multinational rhythm of action in a world totally devoid of instant communication.
So our source material today centers around Jonathan Edwards, specifically his work on extraordinary prayer for the revival of religion.
And we have a very specific stack of texts on the table for this.
Right. We're looking at the very lengthy original title of Edwards' work, an English preface written by John Sutcliff in 1789, an American preface from 1748, and Edwards' own introductory exegesis of Zechariah 8.
It's quite the collection.
It really is. We are basically tracking how a single idea started in Scotland, crossed the perilous Atlantic Ocean, sparked a massive theological treatise in America, and then get this cross back over to England to trigger a multi-denominational movement.
Which is just incredible. But to grasp the sheer scale of this coordination, we really have to start by analyzing the specific terminology Edwards used.
Yeah, the title itself.
Right, because the title of his work functions less like a modern book title and much more like an executive summary or a formal theological declaration.
Yeah, book titles back then were basically the whole pitch right on the cover. I'm going to read the first portion of the original title from our source because it really sets the parameters for everything we're going to discuss today.
Go for it.
Okay, it reads, "An humble attempt to promote an explicit agreement and visible union of God's people through the world in extraordinary prayer for the revival of religion and the advancement of Christ's kingdom on earth, pursuant to scripture promises and prophecies concerning the last time."
There is so much packed in there. But notice the deliberate precision of the language. He specifically says explicit agreement and visible union.
Right, he's not just saying, hey, everyone should pray more.
No, not at all. He is not calling for a general, spontaneous outpouring of religious feeling. In the 18th century theological context, a visible union meant observable, scheduled, structured corporate action.
It required buy-in.
Absolutely. It required ministers to align their congregations with a very specific transatlantic calendar.
And the title actually continues.
Yeah.
And it reveals the catalyst for this whole project. It says this attempt is occasioned by a late memorial published by a number of ministers in Scotland and sent over to America, giving an account of a certain concert for prayer.
Yeah, that Scottish memorial is the true origin point here.
So a memorial in this historical context, that's like a formal petition, right?
Yeah, a memorandum detailing a specific proposal. A coalition of Scottish ministers drafted this document, they had it printed, and they literally placed copies onto ships bound for the American colony.
Just hoping it gets there.
Right. They were aiming to recruit the colonial church into a structured rhythm of intercession.
Okay, but I want to push back on this idea of a concert for a moment.
Yeah.
When we look at this Scottish proposal, were they just trying to get a bunch of people on a schedule, like an administrative victory, so they could claim they had a unified front?
Oh, I see what you mean.
Yeah, because doing all this across the ocean seems like a massive amount of effort just to synchronize calendars. Did they view this visible union as a theological necessity for the advancement of Christ's kingdom?
That is a great question. And the answer is that the Scottish ministers, and Edwards himself, viewed the administrative side and the theological side as completely integrated realities.
Okay, how so?
Well, the visible union of the church was understood as a direct reflection of its spiritual unity. They operated under the conviction that when the visible church united in concerted action, especially in the means of grace like corporate prayer, they were acting in direct alignment with the promises of Scripture regarding the latter days.
So the schedule itself had theological weight.
Yes, exactly. But we need to be clear, they did not view this coordinated prayer as a way to, force God's hand or alter his decrees.
Right, that wouldn't fit their theology at all.
Right. They saw it as the ordained secondary means through which God brings about his promised ends. God decrees the end, but he also decrees the means to that end.
And concerted prayer, does that mean? Think about the sheer conviction required to initiate that, though. You sit down, draft a memorial, send it across a dangerous ocean, and then you just have to wait.
Wait for months.
Yeah, wait half a year to find out if a single minister in Massachusetts or Connecticut even read the thing.
Yeah.
You are relying entirely on the providence of God over maritime weather patterns just to get the mail delivered.
It requires a lot of faith in both God and the postal system of the 1740s.
Seriously. But the astonishing thing is that the mail did arrive. The colonial ministers read it, and the movement gained immense traction.
Traction that was so substantial, it actually generated a feedback loop.
Right, it didn't just stay in America.
No, the idea went from Scotland to America. Edwards expanded it into this massive theological treatise, and then that very treatise traveled back across the Atlantic to influence the English church.
Which brings us to the English preface in our sources. This was written by the Baptist minister John Sutcliff, and it's dated May 4th, 1789.
Right, Sutcliffe. He provides us with this incredibly detailed mapping of how the movement spread geographically and denominationally in England.
Yeah, he talks about this specific association of Baptist ministers in Nottingham. In the year 1784, they formed a resolution to establish a meeting of prayer.
And they locked in a highly specific time for it, too.
They did, the first Monday evening of every calendar month, to be observed by all the churches in their association.
And Sutcliffe tracks the systematic expansion of that resolution. It's fascinating. 2 years later, in 1786, the Midland Baptist Association, meeting at Alchester, adopted the exact same resolution.
It just keeps growing.
Yeah, from there, it moved into the churches in Yorkshire. We see this methodical, region-by-region adoption of the transatlantic schedule.
And what's really wild is that it crossed strict denominational lines, which, was no small feat in the 1780s.
Not at all.
Sutcliffe notes that several Paedobaptist churches started meeting statedly on those same Monday evenings for the identical purpose.
Paedobaptist meaning infant baptizing churches, like the Presbyterians or Congregationalists.
Right. So we have this Scottish idea, amplified by an American theologian, creating a multi-denominational rhythm over in England.
And Sutcliffe has to navigate a very specific ecclesiastical tension in this 1789 preface because of that.
Yeah, he does.
He is highly ecumenical regarding this concert of prayer. He explicitly states that the founders of this institution never intended it to be confined to any peculiar connection or particular denomination.
He welcomes all real friends of truth and holiness to participate.
Exactly.
But I want to clarify something here for the listener, because modern ecumenism often operates by, watering down doctrine, just trying to find the lowest common denominator so everyone can get along.
Oh, yeah. That is definitely not what Sutcliffe is doing.
Not even a little bit. Sutcliffe completely rejects that approach. He fiercely defends what he calls the distinguishing and interesting doctrines of Christianity.
He actually calls out the advocates of error who attempt to overthrow those doctrines.
Right. He insists that these specific theological truths are the absolute grounds of their hope. He demands unity, but it is a unity firmly anchored in historical orthodoxy.
Yeah, he's not giving an inch on his theological convictions. And what makes Sutcliffe's preface particularly fascinating from a publishing standpoint is his explicit disclaimer regarding Jonathan Edwards' eschatology.
Yes, that disclaimer caught my attention immediately.
It's quite the editorial move.
It really is. Sutcliffe is republishing Edwards' work to promote this massive prayer movement, but right there in the preface, he issues a caveat.
He basically says, hey, I'm printing this, but I don't agree with all of it.
Exactly. He writes, by republishing the following work, I do not consider myself as becoming answerable for every sentiment it contains. An author and an editor are very distinct characters.
Which is a brilliant way to phrase it.
He acknowledges that readers might have different views respecting some of the prophecies Edwards advances, but he urges them to approve of the general design anyway.
Right.
So is it common for an 18th century editor to openly distance himself from the author's specific prophetic timelines while simultaneously using that exact same work to launch a movement?
It's fairly unusual to be that blunt about it, but it demonstrates a high degree of intellectual honesty. Sutcliff recognized that Edwards's highly specific typological interpretations, his timelines of prophecy, were debatable even among Orthodox believers at the time.
People were arguing over the details.
Constantly. However, Sutcliffe synthesized a justification for this unified action by presenting a stark, binary worldview. He rendered those secondary disagreements subordinate to the primary mission.
He lays out that binary worldview without any ambiguity whatsoever. He basically states there are only two parties in the world, each engaged in opposite causes.
The cause of God and the cause of Satan.
Right. The cause of holiness and the cause of sin. The cause of heaven and the cause of hell. It's very black and white for him.
In his theological framework, if an individual is a genuine friend of God, then the advancement of the divine cause and the downfall of the opposing cause must be their primary consuming desire.
That has to be the main thing.
Exactly. Consequently, even if believers hold differing sentiments on the exact timeline of prophecy, or even if they practice distinguishing modes of worship regarding baptism, they are obligated to unite in this concerted business of prayer against the kingdom of darkness.
And he concludes his preface with this incredibly vivid visual representation of this unity. He writes, "Oh, for thousands upon thousands, divided into small bands in their respective cities, towns, villages, and neighborhood, all met at the same time and in pursuit of one end, offering up their united prayers like so many ascending clouds of incense before the Most High."
That imagery of ascending incense is stunning, and it actually transitions us seamlessly into the 1748 American preface.
Yeah, let's move to that source now.
Because while Sutcliffe focused heavily on the mechanics of denominational cooperation and the regional spread across England, the American editors zoom way out. They established the theological bedrock of the entire enterprise.
They construct this massive summary of redemptive history. When you read it, it feels like a masterfully edited recap of a sprawling cinematic universe.
That's a great analogy.
They do this theological tracking shot from the very beginning of time all the way to the eschaton. They start all the way back in Eden, focusing on the curse pronounced upon the serpent.
Right, they isolate that specific promise from Genesis that the seed of the woman would bruise the serpent's head.
And the editors describe this as a terrible threatening directed at Satan, but a joyful, foundational prophecy for our first guilty parents.
And then they trace the trajectory of that single promise through the subsequent epochs of biblical history. They track how that general promise was more clearly explained by degrees over time.
Yeah, they follow it to the covenant with Abraham, specifying that in his seed all nations would be blessed. Then they narrow the focus down to a divine king assuming human nature through the specific lineage of Isaac, Jacob, and David.
And then they detail the earthly ministry of this divine king. They describe his birth in Bethlehem, his rejection, his substitutionary death, his resurrection to immortal life, and finally his ascension to heaven, where he currently extends his kingdom over all nations.
I want to zero in on the specific language the editors use regarding how this kingdom expands over the nations, because they are incredibly precise here.
Yeah, the wording matters a lot.
The text states the kingdom spreads, quote, not by outward force, but inward overcoming influence.
That phrase, inward overcoming influence, represents a definitive rejection of coercion.
Which is huge.
It is. The editors are drawing a sharp line between the methods of earthly empires which use violence and legislation and the methods of Christ's kingdom.
I have to point out how radical that distinction was even in the 18th century. State church models and the remnants of coercive religious legislation were still very prevalent in Europe.
Absolutely. The idea of forced religious compliance was still a reality.
But the text explicitly attributes the expansion of the kingdom to his word and spirit making them his willing people in the day of his power.
The theological concept operating here is effectual calling.
Can you break that down for the listener?
Sure. The editors are arguing that genuine advancement of the kingdom does not occur through legislative mandate. It doesn't happen through social pressure or military conquest.
No crusades.
Right. It occurs solely when the Spirit operates through the preached word to alter the internal disposition of individuals, making them willing participants rather than subjugated masses.
And because the kingdom expands through this inward spiritual change, the primary mechanism for its advancement is the work of the Spirit.
Which is exactly why they are coordinating this massive transatlantic prayer effort.
Yes. And this brings us to their use of the golden altar imagery, which I found totally fascinating. It provides the mechanical explanation for how these prayers are actually efficacious.
The American editors present a highly detailed look into the mediatorial reception of prayer. They point to the lively encouragement given in Scripture by representing the prayers of the Church as being offered by Christ himself.
Right. The text makes it very clear that the prayers of the saints are not presented to God in their raw, flawed state.
Because our prayers are often distracted and imperfect.
Exactly. The editors write that these prayers are mingled with the fragrant incense of his own merits and intercession on the golden altar before the throne.
This is a robust articulation of the Reformed doctrine of the mediatorial work of Christ, and that concept provides immense objective comfort for the believer.
Because it means it doesn't all depend on us.
Exactly. The efficacy of the corporate prayer does not rely on the inherent righteousness of the people praying. It doesn't even rely on their perfect concentration.
Which is a relief.
The theological claim is that the mediator takes these imperfect prayers, cleanses them, mingles them with his own infinite merits, and then presents them at the golden altar.
And they ascend together in one grateful perfume. It's a beautiful thought. But from that heavenly throne room imagery, the editors bring the focus straight back down to the physical geography of the earth.
Yeah, they shift from heaven to the map.
They cite the promise that from the rising of the sun, even to the going down of the same, God's name shall be great among the Gentiles, and in every place incense shall be offered.
The text envisions a literal geographical fulfillment of this promise. They write, "How pleasing to God and all the heavenly hosts to see, as the sun goes around the globe, this grateful incense rising from every part on high."
Okay, so I have a logistical question about their mindset regarding this global scope.
Sure, what is it?
They're visualizing this incense rising continuously as the sun goes around the globe. Were they thinking in literal terms of longitudinal time zones? Like, were they intentionally attempting to construct a 24-hour continuous sequence of prayer? Or is this primarily just a poetic device?
It is actually a synthesis of geographical awareness and theological anticipation. Educated individuals in the mid-18th century possessed a firm grasp of the Earth's rotation and longitudinal time differences.
They knew how time worked across the map.
Yes, they understood that noon in Edinburgh occurred at a different absolute moment than noon in Boston or Philadelphia. So while they lacked the technology to synchronize clocks down to the minute, they fully realized that by scheduling this concert of prayer on the exact same day, the physical rotation of the Earth guaranteed something incredible.
A continuous wave.
Exactly. A continuous sequential offering of prayer sweeping westward across the Atlantic.
They linked the geographical extent of the prayer directly to the certainty of the promise. They believed that the more extensive and incessant these prayers were across the circle of the earth, the more the promise moved into its desired fulfillment.
But, and this is a crucial pivot, the American editors do not allow the reader to just rest in this victorious, happy imagery of spreading sunlight and ascending incense.
No, they take a very sharp turn.
They pivot to address a much darker, impending reality based on the eschatological expectations of their era.
Yeah, the text introduces a widespread apprehension among learned men regarding a coming, quote, very general slaughter of the witnesses of Christ.
Which sounds terrifying.
It does.
They are referencing highly specific interpretations of the book of Revelation that were prevalent among Reformed theologians of the period.
They anticipated a defined period where the witnesses of Christ would finish their testimony to the pure worship and truths of the gospel, and this would lead directly to severe persecution.
And the editors provide a very specific eschatological timeline for this. They state this terrible event is predicted to occur roughly 3 or 4 years before the seventh angel sounds his trumpet for the ruin of Antichrist.
So they genuinely anticipated a horrific wave of persecution and martyrdom sweeping across Europe, and they explicitly state that dependent America would likely share in that bloodbath.
That was the theological consensus of their group.
So I have to raise a critical question here.
Go ahead.
If these colonial ministers and their congregations firmly believed that a massive slaughter was imminent within their generation, why coordinate a joyful transatlantic prayer movement for revival?
It seems contradictory, doesn't it?
It really does. If the consensus is that the church is about to face severe devastation, organizing a monthly concert of prayer for the glorious age succeeding seems remarkably counterintuitive. Why not just hide?
The answer lies in their theology of suffering. They were not organizing this concert of prayer to petition God to bypass the decreed trial.
They weren't praying for an escape route?
No. They understood the impending persecution as a necessary precursor to the promised expansion. The text states that the approach of such a terrible time means the more need we have of joining in earnest and constant prayers for extraordinary suffering graces for ourselves and others.
Extraordinary suffering graces. That concept is vital here.
It is the key to understanding their mindset.
They were asking for the spiritual stamina, the theological fortitude, and the internal resolve to endure the coming agony without apostatizing.
Exactly.
It functions much like an athlete training for an extreme mountain endurance race.
Oh, that's a good way to look at it.
Yeah, like when you commit to a 100-mile run over severe elevation, you do not petition the race organizers to flatten the mountains or to remove the harsh weather.
Because the mountains are the point of the race.
Exactly. You know the agony is an integral part of the event. Instead, you prepare your body and mind to handle the suffering when it inevitably arrives. You ask for the capacity to endure, not for the exemption from the trial.
And the American editors viewed historical trials through a parallel lens. They grounded this perspective directly in the precedent of Christ's earthly ministry.
Right.
The text argues that the coming of this terrible time is no more an objection against praying for the hastening of the following glory than it was an objection before the incarnation of Christ.
They explicitly note that his most bitter sufferings were required to precede the spreading of his joyous kingdom among the nations.
The theological framework dictates that the body must follow the pattern of the head.
Okay, explain that a bit more.
Well, just as the intense sufferings of Christ preceded his resurrection and the subsequent explosion of the early church, the intense sufferings of his members must precede the glorious latter-day expansion of the church.
So the trial is the ordained precursor to the triumph.
Yes. Therefore, the nearer the day of slaughter approached, the more they felt compelled to engage in continual watchfulness and concerted prayer. They were preparing for the amazing changes hastening on the earth.
So they were simultaneously praying for the grace to die well and the grace for the church to subsequently flourish. It represents a profoundly resilient eschatology.
It really does. So having established the logistical origins, the English denominational expansion, the overarching redemptive narrative, and the anticipation of suffering, we must now examine the core exegesis.
Right, the actual biblical text Jonathan Edwards provides to justify this entire transatlantic undertaking.
Edwards anchors his argument in the Old Testament prophets. Specifically, he focuses on Zechariah chapter 8, verses 20 through 22.
Let me read that text for the listener. It reads, "It shall yet come to pass that there shall come people and the inhabitants of many cities, and the inhabitants of one city shall go to another, saying, Let us go speedily to pray before the Lord and to seek the Lord of hosts. I will go also."
And the prophecy concludes by stating that many people and strong nations shall come to seek the Lord in Jerusalem.
So how does Edwards approach this specific passage?
Edwards approaches this text utilizing a strict logical deduction based on historical verification. He sets out to prove that this prophecy remains unfulfilled.
Which necessitates that it points to a future massive expansion of the church.
Right. He builds his case by examining the specific time period between the delivery of Zechariah's prophecy and the advent of the Messiah. He surveys the historical record of the Jewish nation during that interim.
And he focuses heavily on the mathematics implied in the prophecy, right?
Yes, the math is crucial to his argument. The text suggests an accession of Gentile nations so vast that the new worshippers would overwhelmingly outnumber the original visible worshippers.
And Edwards identifies a specific ratio in the text.
He does. He identifies a 10-to-1 ratio in the prophetic language, which he interprets as a certain number for an uncertain, signifying an unprecedented, overwhelming influx of the nations.
Edwards states his conclusion unequivocally. He says, "There never happened anything from the time of the prophet Zechariah to the coming of Christ to answer this prophecy."
So, by a process of historical elimination, it must refer to the future. He asserts it can only find its fulfillment either in the initial calling of the Gentiles after the days of the apostles or in the future glorious enlargement of the church in the latter ages of the world.
And Edwards forcefully argues for the latter. But to understand his logic, we really have to look at his use of typological hermeneutics.
Right, the way he interprets the text.
I want to push back on Edwards' methodology here.
Okay, let's hear it.
Zechariah is writing to a very specific, literal historical audience. The Jewish people are actively dealing with the physical realities of returning from the Babylonish captivity and attempting to resettle the physical land of Canaan.
That's the immediate context, yes.
Right. So is Edwards doing legitimate exegesis by applying this to an 18th century transatlantic prayer meeting? Or is he simply reading his own colonial optimism into an ancient text?
Well, Edwards actually anticipates that exact critique. He is well aware of the historical context. He acknowledges it.
He does.
Yeah, he admits that the prophet, in some parts of this chapter, has respect to the future smiles of heaven on the Jewish nation returning from Chaldea. He does not deny the literal immediate application.
But he argues that the literal context cannot contain the sheer magnitude of the prophetic language.
Exactly. He views these physical, historical events as faint resemblances of far greater spiritual realities.
This is the crux of typological interpretation within Reformed hermeneutics. Edward contends that the Spirit of God routinely uses the divine favors attending the physical return from Babylon as the vocabulary to speak of incomparably greater blessings.
Blessings that will attend the deliverance of the church from what Edwards terms spiritual or mystical Babylon.
Right, mystical Babylon.
Precisely. The physical city of Babylon functions as a type. It's a historical shadow of the church's greater spiritual enemy, which Reformed theology of the era frequently identified as the papal Antichrist system.
So when Zechariah speaks of God bringing his people from the east and west to Jerusalem, Edwards argues this cannot chiefly respect the historical return of the Jews under Zerubbabel or Nehemiah.
Because the historical reality of that return simply did not match the 10-to-1 ratio of the nations flowing into the worship of Yahweh.
The historical event was just a minor fraction of the prophetic scope. Consequently, Edwards concludes the text must have respect to the great calling and gathering of the Jews and Gentiles into the fold of Christ after the destruction of mystical Babylon.
And Edwards doesn't just stop there. He reinforces this typological reading by cross-referencing a substantial network of other prophetic texts. He refuses to build his case on Zechariah alone.
Yeah, he brings in Isaiah chapter 60, which speaks of the Gentiles coming to the light and kings to the brightness of thy rising.
He also integrates Isaiah chapter 66, examining the rhetorical questions. Shall the earth be made to bring forth in one day? Shall a nation be born at once? He connects us to the imagery of a flowing stream of Gentiles expanding the borders of the church.
And he also heavily utilizes Micah chapter 4, that famous passage regarding the mountain of the house of the Lord being established in the top of the mountains and people flowing unto it.
The specific result detailed in the Micah passage is critical for Edwards. The nations beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore.
So Edwards synthesizes all of these texts to demonstrate that there is a future unprecedented era of global peace and massive church expansion decreed by God. He surveys the historical timeline up to the 1740s and states there has been nothing yet brought to pass in any measure to answer these prophecies.
Right. So when the Scottish memorial arrives on his desk proposing a transatlantic concert of prayer, he perceives it not just as a good idea. He sees it as the literal mechanism by which the church can actively participate in the fulfillment of Zechariah 8.
The inhabitants of one city saying to another across the ocean, let us go speedily to pray before the Lord.
It is an incredible fusion of rigorous textual exegesis and aggressive contemporary action. They analyze the ancient texts, determine the eschatological timeline, and organize their ecclesiastical calendars to execute the requirements of the prophecy.
It's just wild to think about. Tracing the entire sequence of events we have discussed today reveals an astonishing transatlantic feedback loop.
It really does.
I mean, we began with a Scottish memorial drafted by a coalition of ministers seeking coordinated prayer. We tracked that physical document as it crossed the hazardous Atlantic shipping routes to land in the colonies.
Then we examined how Jonathan Edwards utilized that document to engineer a massive theological framework, supported by the American editors who provided a sweeping view of redemptive history and the bracing necessity of suffering graces in the face of impending slaughter.
And then we followed the resulting treatise as it traveled back to England, where John Sutcliff and the Baptist associations utilized it to forge a multi-denominational rhythm of prayer, overcoming secondary doctrinal disputes to present a unified front against the kingdom of darkness, offering up their prayers as ascending clouds of incense sequentially across the time zones.
This historical reality leaves us with a highly challenging final thought for you, the listener.
Yeah, lay it on us.
We observed this 18th century movement, operating in a world where communication was dangerously slow, fragile, and routinely lost to the elements. Yet, these individuals successfully coordinated a unified, multinational action based entirely on a shared theological conviction derived from ancient texts.
So the question is, what does it reveal about the modern disposition that, despite possessing instant, frictionless global communication, we so frequently fail to unite around shared goals with even a fraction of the resolve demonstrated by those utilizing paper, ink, and the wind?
It really challenges our assumption that superior technology automatically yields superior unity. It suggests instead that deep theological conviction remains the primary driver of cohesive action.
That is definitely something to think about. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive on Reformed thinking. We will see you next time.